Chapter 9. Michael Dummett, a bumbling anti-racist. When they come downstairs from their ivory towers, idealists are very apt to walk straight into the gutter. Michael Dummett was Wykeham Professor of Logic at Oxford and Fellow of All Souls College. He is one of the most celebrated philosophers of the 20th century, with important contributions to the philosophy of language, the philosophy of mathematics, and the history of analytic philosophy. He received many prestigious awards, including the Lakatos Award in the Philosophy of Science in 1994, the Rolf Schock Prize in 1995, and the Launer Prize for an outstanding oeuvre in analytical philosophy in 2010. Paid by Oxford to do research, does politics instead. Dummett was knighted in 1999 for services to philosophy and racial justice, but his contributions to these two areas were not always in perfect harmony. The clash started very early in his career, in 1964. Back from Stanford in the autumn of 1964, Anne and I decided that the time had come for organized resistance to the swelling racism in England. From that moment, while keeping up with my heavy teaching load, I devoted every moment I could spare to the fight against racism. I abandoned my book on Frege. I gave no more time to thinking about philosophy. This condition lasted until the summer of 1968. This is a striking confession. An Oxford philosophy professor admits he abandoned all attempt at creative work in philosophy and gave no more time to thinking about philosophy for a full 4 years. Although this was an important part of his job description and what he was actually paid to do. Instead of devoting his time to philosophical research, he engaged in political activity because he simply decided the latter was more pressing, entirely unconcerned with the fact that this constituted a breach of his contractual obligations with the university. The only reason he did not neglect his philosophical work for longer than 4 years is that he became disappointed with the effects of his efforts against racism. In any case, Dummett's way of waging a battle against racism had itself many strange and illogical aspects. Here he describes how he became involved in helping asylum seekers upon their arrival in the UK. At that time, the mid-60s, there were no entry clearance certificates. People simply arrived at the airport and were put back on the next plane if the immigration officer refused them. It was possible, however, to intervene and make representations on a refused immigrant's behalf if one could do so before he was put on the plane. I, of my own initiative, took up this work. I set up a network of informants at Heathrow who would telephone me at any hour of the day or night to tell me if someone refused and with no one to speak for them. I would then have first to telephone the chief immigration officer, which took a long time to get through, say I wished to make representations, and then dash to the airport as quickly as possible. There I had to find out what I could about the case and say whatever I could on the refused person's behalf. He was then often admitted. This was the most exhausting period of my life. Notice the odd thing about the regular scenario. Upon receiving the information that someone has been refused by immigration officers, Dummett dashed to the airport as quickly as possible, and it is only then and there, at the airport, that he had to find out what he could about the case and say whatever he could on the refused person's behalf. This means Dummett went to the airport with the intention of defending someone's right to stay in the United Kingdom without knowing the background facts of this person's case at all. We have to ask ourselves, given this level of initial blind commitment, would it have been easy for him, upon reaching the airport, to recognize indications that say some of these people might have been coming to the UK to escape criminal charges in their homeland? Surely there must have been many cases of people who tried, for various reasons, to get into the UK by claiming falsely that they had been persecuted in their countries. A logician's strange route to empirical truth. 2 years after becoming Wykeham Professor of Logic at Oxford, Dummett published a paper in which he claimed, "It should seem obvious that contemporary psychologists in the United States and Britain, advancing the thesis of the hereditary inferiority of Negro intelligence, are, reflecting prejudices still widespread in these countries, and that hereditarianism about race differences in IQ, so obviously conforming to a palpably powerful prejudice, can be set aside by any rational judge without further examination. Dummett's reasoning is transparently fallacious. Clearly, even beliefs conforming to a palpably powerful prejudice may in fact be strongly supported by evidence. Moreover, they may well be correct. Exactly the opposite of what Dummett is saying is true. No opinion should be rejected merely because it conforms to a powerful prejudice. The idea that it might be rational for a person lacking necessary expertise to dismiss a scientific hypothesis without further examination is alien to both the common sense and empiricism that have been a mark of British philosophy for centuries. It is regrettable that when it comes to psychological research about racial differences, Dummett did not heed the excellent general advice that an ignorant but rational person can be no more than agnostic about questions that require a moderate degree of knowledge to answer. The name of the philosopher who gave that advice is Michael Dummett. Later, Dummett tried again, but in a different way, to show that the possibility of a significant genetically based IQ difference between racial groups can be dismissed a priori. Here is his argument. No one can rationally think that the great majority of members of any racial group are intellectually or artistically inferior to the great majority of members of some other group. It is obvious that within any racial group, there is a great range of intelligence and of artistic talents. A belief in the inferiority of a whole racial group in either respect can be sustained with some show of rationality only if it is held that the group will never produce anyone of the highest achievements. Although Dummett insisted that no one can rationally think that the great majority of members of any racial group are intellectually inferior to the great majority of members of some other group, some scholars doing research on these issues have thought exactly this and offered a rationale for their view. For example, citing the official data from the University of California at Berkeley, Arthur Jensen, 1991-182, a very prominent psychologist, stated that 90% of students belonging to the group consisting of blacks and Hispanics had a lower SAT score 2 than 90% of those belonging to the group consisting of whites and Asians, thereby producing precisely the kind of near bimodal distribution that Dummett so adamantly ruled out a priori. Let me stress that I am not claiming here that Jensen was necessarily right. My point is only that Dummett was clearly wrong in his resolute claim about what no one can rationally think. Dummett's only reason in support of his claim is the assertion that a belief in the inferiority of a certain group is sustainable, with some show of rationality, only if the group in question will never produce anyone of the highest achievement. But he is wrong about that too. Yes, if Group A has a sufficiently higher mean IQ than Group B, then under the assumption of normal distribution, a great majority of A's will indeed have a higher IQ than a great majority of B's. But no, Dummett is wrong in saying that this situation entails that Group B will never produce anyone of the highest achievement. Simply, the premises are statistical, and for this reason alone, they just cannot establish the conclusion that Group B will never produce a very high achiever. On the contrary, rather than the probability of a very high achiever in Group B being 0, as Dummett says, it will in reality always have a positive numerical value. Moreover, as the group size increases, the probability will rise steadily, becoming closer and closer to 1. One does not expect this kind of misjudgment about elementary statistics from someone who received the prestigious Lakatos Award in the philosophy of science, which, as noted, Dummett did in 1994. Although his erroneous inference might perhaps be regarded as a well-meaning but clumsy attempt to advance racial justice, it certainly does not qualify as service to philosophy. A pimp, a criminal, and a racist invited to talk at All Souls College. Another troubling feature of Dummett's political activism is the company he occasionally kept. Of course, when fighting for a social cause, one often has to join forces with people who may be controversial in many respects. But here we are talking about something more drastic and sinister. Let me start with a passage from Christopher Hitchens's autobiography. A ludicrous but menacing local figure had named himself Michael X in the hope of attracting some cross-Atlantic street cred. As a Trinidadian pimp and hustler called Michael de Freitas, he had won notoriety as an especially nasty enforcer of evictions for a rack rent landlord, named, in one of those Dickensian coincidences, Mr. Rashman. The soi-disant X had a group, actually a gang, called RAS. The letters were supposed to stand for Racial Adjustment Action Society, and some white liberal clergymen and similar dupes were induced to take it seriously. But in Caribbean patois, as one soon discovered, a Raz was a used tampon. At Oxford in my first term, a rather silly Catholic bleeding heart don named Michael Dummett managed to use his privileges to get X to speak in the All Souls dining room. Aside from the Hitchensian rhetorical flourishes, is his basic report trustworthy? First of all, Michael X was indeed a shady character deeply immersed in a criminal milieu, but this did not stop him from being active in the Black Power movement and founding RAS. And second, Dummett was at the time heavily involved with another organization called the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARD, whose goals largely overlapped with those of RAS. So the two groups inevitably had mutual contacts and attempted to find a common platform in fighting for the same anti-racism cause. Therefore, it seems prima facie very plausible that the two Michaels did meet on some occasion and that they knew each other. Hitchens places their joint appearance at All Souls at the time of his own first term as a student at Oxford in the fall of 1967, just after Michael X had garnered a lot of press attention with a speech in Reading. This was the height of his political fame, the best moment for anyone to invite him to speak and expect that people would be interested. Another black activist, Stokely Carmichael, reports in his autobiography that he met Michael X in London in the summer of 1967 and that his new acquaintance told him he had just attended a meeting with some decent, very respectable people and discussed with them solutions to the growing racial problem in Britain. One of these respectable people was identified as an Oxford Don. As this was the time when Dummett had abandoned all attempt at creative work in philosophy, and when he was devoting every minute that he could spare to battling racism, he must be the main candidate for being that Oxford Don. It is virtually impossible that anyone else at Oxford at that time had this level of academically self-destructive devotion to the cause. In sum, we see the convergence of different lines of evidence that corroborates the story about Michael X speaking at All Souls at Dummett's invitation. Some will say, so what? Even if it's true that Dummett was naive to get mixed up with a certain criminal who abused women for profit, what's the larger point here? Well, Michael X was not just a criminal, but a vocal and notorious racist too. In the aforementioned Reading speech that put him in the public eye, he said, among other things, "If you ever see a white man laying hands on a black woman, kill him immediately. Whitey is a vicious, nasty person. The fear of this white monkey is nothing. We will deal with him if necessary. The white man has no soul. You are dealing with a heartless sort of person if you are talking to a white man," reported in the Times of London, September 30th, 1967. For these statements, he was later convicted of inciting racial hatred and spent 8 months in jail. If after Michael X's inflammatory statements came to public attention, Dummett still decided to give such a person a platform at Oxford, he displayed a shocking lack of judgment, especially for someone professing to oppose racism of any kind. But did Michael X really give a talk at All Souls? Indeed, this is conclusively confirmed by a short report published in the London Times on October 24, 1967, according to which Michael X did talk in front of 200 people at All Souls College. He warned them about impending race riots in Britain and repeated his racist message by saying, "I get terrified of white people because I know they are vicious and nasty." Obviously, this kind of incendiary statement should not have surprised anyone, given what he had said in his widely publicized reading speech. And this is precisely why a post-reading talk at the London School of Economics was promptly cancelled by the organizers. In contrast, his Oxford host, an arch critic of racism, was neither alarmed nor had any second thoughts about inviting a person who was at that very time being tried in a court of law for stirring up race hatred. 2 weeks after his appearance at All Souls, Michael X was convicted for his previous statements inciting race hatred and went straight to jail. Soon after his release, he was involved in another criminal-cum-racist incident and had to leave England in order to avoid a new trial and probable conviction. He moved back to Trinidad, where he was implicated in 2 murders. In one of them, a young English woman was first badly injured in a botched murder attempt and then finished off by being buried alive. In the end, Michael X was sentenced to death in Trinidad and executed in 1975. Someone will say these gruesome developments could not have been anticipated. But in fact, there were clear and ominous signs that Michael X was capable of committing horrible crimes, including murder. For example, he is quoted as having said at the Reading Magistrates Court hearing, "Killing is a very strange thing. The first time I ever killed a man, I thought about it. A book I read said I would not be able to sleep at night. But that is not true. You can sleep at night." Dummett was most probably aware of this because what transpired in the courtroom was extensively reported in the newspapers, and also because the whole trial was closely monitored by a solicitor on behalf of the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, in which, as noted, Dummett was very active. A fact that bears emphasis: it was only some 3 weeks after Michael X's statements about killing came to public attention that All Souls College put out the welcome mat for him. If despite all those red flags, Dummett was still willing to lend support and respectability to a thug, pimp, and racist, this raises another worry about his judgment. Could it be that Dummett was sometimes similarly clueless when, as mentioned above, he rushed from Oxford to Heathrow to represent newly arrived asylum seekers, and when he may have again occasionally swallowed tall tales of political persecution that were in some cases just a ruse of his protégés to enter the country with not necessarily the best intentions? A sham engagement with philosophy. Dummett was once asked whether he saw any connection between his philosophical ideas and his struggle against racism. He responded that he did see a connection in the following sense. "In the situation we were then in Britain, I saw a possibility for me to do something significant in a sector in which there were very few people taking any such action or even aware what the situation was. I do not think I could have respected myself as a philosopher if I had not undertaken that work. I should have felt that all my engagement with philosophy was a sham." Dummett has got things backwards in his own case. He worried that had he not undertaken his significant political work, he could not have respected himself as a philosopher, and that his engagement with philosophy would have been a sham. In reality, however, the worry about losing respect for himself as a philosopher should have been prompted not by what Dummett counterfactually might have failed to do, but rather by what he actually did, i.e., waged an ill-considered battle against racism, made patently false and illogical statements in this context, and got duped into a shady world of reverse racism, ideological manipulation, and criminality. And yet for a full 4 years, Dummett was so enthusiastic about this kind of political engagement that for its sake, he gave no more time to thinking about philosophy. But he failed to see the obvious. Working as a philosopher for years while simultaneously abandoning thinking about philosophy comes as close as one can get to having an engagement with philosophy that is a sham. Could we imagine, by way of analogy, a surgeon who became upset about some social injustice and who, although continuing to work at the hospital, devoted every moment he could spare to his noble political cause and gave no more time to thinking about medicine for years? Hardly, because his lack of dedication to his profession would be soon detected by his patients, colleagues, and administrators, and he could not hope to keep his job with such an attitude. It is a sad testimony to how irrelevant and dispensable philosophical activity has become, even in the eyes of philosophers themselves, that neither Dummett nor other philosophers apparently saw anything wrong in his open admission that over a long period of time he largely replaced his expected and remunerated philosophical work with political activism. Quite the opposite, his behavior has been regarded as admirable.